I suppose I'll just start by saying to people that Tony and I thought that what we might do is he'll keep an eye on the questions that are coming in. And at the end, I'll have a discussion with Tony where I'll try and pick up as many of those questions as possible. So you've probably got 50 minutes or so of me now just talking at you from a screen, which I hope is okay. I'll turn the slides over to keep you awake from time to time. We'll have that. The other thing I suppose I should say is I haven't actually given a public lecture in about 5 months. And I was saying to somebody this morning that I think that's the longest time I've gone in my adult life without giving a talk. That's been a combination of being ill with COVID and the lockdown. So this is my return to the field. So do be gentle with me because I might have forgotten how to do this. But with that said, let me begin the talk. At the end of the talk, I'll actually situate this research because it's one of 3 pieces of research which interconnect, but I'll come to that at the end of the talk and give you references to each. In the talk, I'll be talking about the data that we're using, the background to the research, the work we've done on register, the work on correlation, also something which is striking me as being of real interest, and I hope it will strike you as being of interest after this talk, self-correlation, the type of thing that I have usually ignored to date when I've seen it within lists of collocation, looking at things which collocate with themselves, but also things which correlate with themselves. We'll look at that. And then I want to focus on something which isn't talked about as often as it perhaps should be within corpus linguistics, cohesion, that textual level that may help is in our analysis. And then at the end, give a sort of sociological framing to my finding by talking about Bourdieu's concept of symbolic capital, which I think actually does neatly frame a lot of what I will be presenting to you now. Okay, with that said, let's start talking about the data. We had access to a really very interesting data set in that we had access to materials which had been involved in police cases in the UK, where the people involved in the case had been convicted of terrorist acts. And what we had access to were lists of texts which were found on their hard drives, which were thought to be relevant to the case somehow, and which had been looked at by defense and security analysts and broken into 3 broad categories, which I'll describe in a little more detail at the moment, in a moment. Extreme, moderate, and fringe. Roughly speaking for now, just let's say moderate is entirely innocent stuff about Islam, fringe is, it looks a bit problematic, and extreme is where people are clearly advocating violence. We also had access to an anonymous report written for the UK Home Office about such data, which described the process of classification, the texts involved, and also explained how there was a link to their ratings, and gave some information gathered from conversations with key members of the Muslim community in the UK in terms of how they viewed these texts and issues that they found to be problematic. So as I said, the real key point here is all of the texts were involved in successful terrorist prosecutions in the UK. So in terms of building the corpus, if somebody said to me, what is this representative of? Actually, it really is representative of something. It's representative of the types of texts that attention was paid to by those who were later convicted of terrorist acts. Now, obviously, there's an implication of causation there, which I don't think is unreasonable in the case of, say, certainly the extremist texts, given the actions that people were engaged with. So this is clearly quite focused. And you might be able to hear the police closing in on me behind me now. I don't know why they're doing that all of a sudden. Okay, so that's the data we've got. To give you an idea of the scale of it, we have that many texts in the extreme, fringe, and moderate category, relatively modest size of data, but remember this is highly focused. The topic here is texts about Islam in some way. So it's very, very focused, and also the categorization is highly germane really to the process by which the corpus is selected. Okay, so to give a little bit more detail on the classification, and this is actually just quotations from Holbrook, who did a lot of the work. In the extreme category, we're seeing texts which endorse or glorify violence in a contemporary context, or are starkly dehumanizing, talking about non-Muslims, for example, in starkly dehumanizing ways. In the fringe texts, we're looking at religiously or ideologically conservative, and the key point is isolationist texts. So they're actually advocating a withdrawal from the society within which these people are living. And then in the moderate text, there's no way that there's a link to encouragement to violence, isolationism, extreme beliefs, or any contemporary views relating to violence. Now, most of the texts are written in English, and of course, some people might think, oh, wait there, isn't that a particular problem? Well, actually, no. In the context of the UK, people who are convicted of offences like this typically speak English and sometimes a language from the Indian subcontinent. They certainly don't speak Arabic. They may be able to recite the Quran by heart, but they don't speak Arabic. So in fact, here we have texts where the principal means of transmission was the English language. So the fact that these texts sometimes are translations from the point of view of the people who were consuming the text is, if you like, neither here nor there. They couldn't go back to the original Arabic and critique the translation. They were taking the translation as literal. And that actually informs our views also. There were some interesting points relating to code switching. I'm not covering that here today, but I will give you a reference to a book later on where we do cover some of that work. But also non-standard orthography. That actually was one of the main challenges of sort of routine technical sense, main challenges that we had to face in this work. A lot of the terminology drawn from the Quran, for example, was subject to non-standard orthography. While there are canonical forms of these words that are used in the English language when we're writing English, it's often the case that we'd find new forms of the words written which tried to represent features of the phonology of Arabic as the people who were doing the translation perceived them. So actually you've got quite a bit of variant spelling in this. And I've given you some examples there. And it seemed to vary actually across the moderate, fringe, and extreme categories. I won't make a great point about this here, but just looking at the example there of jizya and jizyah, where you're trying to emphasize this aspiration, that's clearly much more common in extreme, in the fringe, or the moderate. So as usual, of course, it's possible to make political points via orthography, and in this case, some of the translators almost certainly were. And it's interesting that that orthography aligns with ideological stances. Okay, so the first part of the analysis is what I call desperately seeking register, which is something which I'll explain in a moment. But we thought initially of looking at this simply in terms of register. Might it be the case that the extreme texts, for example, represented a register on their own relative to the others, or some combination thereof? So maybe fringe was a separate register. So were there text internal differences conditioned by context of use that might leave these linguistic clues that we could pick up using something like multiple correspondence analysis or that type of analysis, that we might be able to distinguish the text apart in terms of registers? The idea is plausible, certainly. We might say that perhaps there's more overt persuasion in the fringe text than there is in the moderate text. Maybe the extreme texts, where some of them are talking about bomb making, for example, might be more instructional in nature in terms of it. So we thought it was certainly a plausible hypothesis to explore, to see whether register might be one way in which we could start to separate these texts out, or another way, begin to justify the categorization that had already been imposed from the text from a non-linguistic perspective. So we thought we'd use MDA in this case, Weber's register variation technique, which is very helpful. And it allowed us to compare the text types to others in present-day English also. We had a gold standard to compare to, in the sense that that analysis has also been carried out on general corpora. How did we do it? Well, actually, we used Andrea Nini's very handy mat package for the standard Bible analysis. But as I move on through this part of the talk, we start adding in factors to the factor analysis. And for that, I use the, I think Tony was talking about the free tools we provide online, and one of them is Lancaster Stats Tools and CQP Web. We use Lancaster Stats Tools to do some of the things like eigenvalue plotting and the MDA. And then 𝗃𝗶𝗃𝗴𝗏 is also very helpful, has a nice feature that allows you to bring these together into a data matrix for analysis. So we use those to do the more novel styles of MBA that we were looking at. And when I say the results from Нини's package were disappointing, I mean that the initial analysis of the 𝗵𝗿𝗱𝗃 style was disappointing from the point of view of the perspective, from the point of view of what we wanted to achieve with them, not that Нини's packages. Let me show you what I mean. If we look at the eigenvalue plots for the corpus, we can go down it. You can see the type of information that you'd normally get with this. We have the scree plot, so we can decide how many dimensions we want to look at. We also have the p-values, so we can see what extent that this might be significant. And also, I think this is key here, the r² value on the right, which shows what the degree of the variation, the scale of the variation that's described by that dimension. And as you can see, not much is explained by this standard plot. So if you look at dimension 1, for example, they're actually quite closely bunched together. So if we just take that sort of standard approach to it, we don't actually find much that would tease apart moderate, fringe, and extreme. And that's when I start to desperately seek register, because I could take that message to say, well, actually, they're all using the same register. It really isn't something which introduces any element of variation. But I thought it might be the case that there might be various factors that we haven't included in the analysis that might actually allow us to start to break the data apart in some way other than simply moderate, fringe, and extreme. So, for example, we know some of the authors. Maybe there are distinctive authorial styles. We also know some of the genres in question. We also know sometimes where the original medium was speech or writing, or at least we may think we do. The reason I say that is that sometimes, as you'll see, actually we don't show it here, we're doing one of the papers, but actually what we found was that some of the things that we think were speech turn out to look very much like oralized scripts. So nonetheless, we do know in principle that something was spoken or written. Do any of these things help? If we include these within our factor analysis, do any of them help? Do we suddenly find this golden moment where the texts break apart and we start to discern real differences from the point of view of register analysis? No, is the answer to that. I'll give you an example by looking at genre. In this case, we've gone through and we've marked up each text, given them metadata to demonstrate what type of genre it was originally written in. And on the right-hand side, you're looking at it, right-hand side, you can see how the jihadist corpus data broke apart. On the left-hand side, I'm comparing that to, if you like, this gold standard I was talking about, the general English analysis by 𝗵𝗿𝗱𝗃. You can see I've expanded the scale on the right-hand side because, in fact, they're very tightly jammed together around 0. We only really get one thing which comes off, and that's the forum data, and that gives us a good result on involved versus informational. But it's not very helpful because actually in the data set, we only have, I think, one example of a forum discussion. So it is identifying something as being the odd one out, but that might actually be an artifact of us only having one of them in the data. And even if it isn't that, well, it is exceptional, and we can see that when we look at it. Similarly, on narrative and non-narrative, again, we find an outlier, in this case, a poem, but there is only one poem. So although it is rightly identifying this as being rather different from the other things that are in there, it's not actually giving us a great insight into the data itself. And as we go through the different dimensions, each time where we're finding something where the r² score is reasonably high, we're finding it's either the forum data or the poem, or on occasion, both. So the message over and over again from our analysis of the data is that most of it seems to be using the same register or a very narrow band of registers, and the data is actually quite tightly packed together when we look at it from the point of view of register. Now, of course, a naive way of looking at this result is to say, well, isn't that disappointing? Doesn't that show that this doesn't really show us very much? Well, no, it actually shows us a great deal. it shows us that in spite of our attempts to prize these things apart and separate them into separate registers, they stubbornly remain within one register. It's generally around general narrative or involved narrative. So that actually is a really important point, and we will pick it up later on. So let me just ask you to hold that idea in your mind. But what about specialized vocabulary? I've already shown you some of it in the example with jizya earlier on, but it is something actually which is really quite noticeable in the text. They're accessing concepts from Islamic scholarship, for example. And in the document that we had from Anon, as I shall call them, the Muslim leaders who had looked at the data said actually the really important thing to focus on are the concepts from Islam and how they are used. So we had some indication both from our own exploration of the text, but more importantly, from leading members of the Muslim community, that it was actually somehow around this use of the technical terminology, if you like, of Islam, that we might start to find what was breaking the data apart. It might be the driver behind the different persuasive rhetorical strategies used, for example, by the fringe and extreme actors. And this was also something that appeared in the analysts' notes, which was very helpful. We had access to those also, the people who'd broken the texts into moderate, fringe, extreme. And very often when they were explaining why they'd done it, they would draw on this fund of concepts and say, because of the approach in the text to kufar, for example, this is. So that was very helpful. But what words could we use? We could look in random documents and say, there are the words, but that's not very helpful. There were 6 words in particular identified in the Anon report, but there were many more identified within the analyst notes. And we also had to do quite a lot of work, referring back to something I mentioned earlier in the talk, to find the different variant forms and also to normalize those for the purposes of our analysis. But just to give you an idea of the word forms that we did finally look at, those are them. You can have a look at those. Note that that was a clever tactic so I could have some tea. Have a look at those. I don't expect you to understand any of those words. I'm sure that actually some of you on here are well aware of these words and understand them better than I ever will. But at the moment, I'm really looking at them from the abstract point of view of a linguist looking at these words and seeing how they behave. I know that they're characterized as a set because they have a particular role, a particular function to play within a certain religion, but the specific meaning of any of them at this point isn't necessarily of enormous interest, other than for this suspicion that they may actually be key in terms of generating this 3-part distinction used by the analysts. And through that, we might start to understand the dynamics of how those 3-part distinctions come about. Now, if I add those into the MDA, what do I find? There's the scree plot for it. Again, I find 7 things that I might want to look at. But actually, when I looked at the MDA, that didn't really break it apart either. But what we did notice in looking at the texts is that just from looking at them, we got the impression that some concepts were drawing upon others. So if you see A mentioned, you're likely to see B mentioned. So we decided to explore, setting aside the question of register, the question of correlation between these particular terms that we'd identified that we thought might be key, and indeed the analysts, members of the Muslim community, thought might be key in generating these 3 categories of text. So we decided to use a parametric test of correlation for reasons outlined in Burstiness' book. And for each of the fringe, extreme, and moderate texts, we looked at covariance of pairs of terms within the text to see if any varied systematically, either in positive or negative terms. So for each term, we checked against every other term in the data set to see whether or not they covaried in some predictable way. So did they attract one another? Did they repel one another? Or did they just mill around one another in some non-interesting way? We followed Cohen in terms of splitting the correlation score into 4 broad bands. And here today, I'm only really going to interest myself in medium and large effects. And I'm only really going to talk about positive medium and large effects because we didn't find any negative medium and large effects, which again is a finding in itself. There weren't repellent concepts, but there were some highly attracting concepts in that. Just to give you a quick visual impression, and this was helpful for us, and it's something you can get through the Lancaster stats tool, we made a heat map, if you like, of the correlations. Now, if correlation wasn't interesting here, this would be pretty much blank other than that sort of autocorrelation line, which you see going diagonally across it. And this is for all text. And we can immediately see from the heat map that there seems to be something going on. It seems to be reasonably selective. We're not just getting either a solid block or an empty screen. If we look in extreme, the solid bars are where you're not finding evidence. So that's where there are zeros. But if you ignore that, there are plenty of dark reds that are starting to appear. Similarly with the fringe, we're seeing darker colors appear, dark blues appear. Similarly here, we're seeing dark blues in the fringe data, and we're seeing dark blues in the moderate. Now, obviously I accept that you can't read these terms at the moment, but that's not the point of these three charts. These three charts are there to show that there is something happening with correlation of these terms. Those dark blue squares within this little diagram here, for example, for moderate, is showing that two of the terms here are co-varying in the same way. They're appearing together. It's positive. So if you see A in the document, you're likely to see B also, and they're varying in a similar way. So what is the nature of that variation? How does it work? And how may it give us insight into any of the things we're looking at? Well, a first and simple way to look at that is simply to look at the terms correlated with a medium effect or a large effect. In the left hand in this table, you see medium effect. In the right hand, you see large effect. And what do we see? Well, you're seeing there the numbers of pairs of correlations that we're finding. So it's quite large in number. But also, if you just think about it in terms of ranking, well, over on the left-hand side, if we're looking at extreme, fringe, and moderate only, we might think, well, this correlation seems to be most populous within the fringe. Interestingly, over on the right-hand side, we see it's most populous amongst the fringe. So these are interesting patterns that we're starting to see emerge from there. Interestingly, also, we're not seeing any of these pairs of correlations that occur in all three of the categories. Sometimes we see extreme and fringe, extreme and moderate, fringe and moderate. So you might start to make some type of argument about gradients going across the piece, but there's no pair of correlates which are occurring as medium or large effect within all three of them. So they seem to be particularizing themselves also. They're getting attracted to being in just one of the categories, typically, or on occasions in pairs of categories. So there seems to be some degree of what I would claim would be motivated variation in the covariance of these terms. To give an idea of the types of things that we're seeing also in terms of low or no correlation, or where there's a frequency of 0, remember those solid bars in the heat map, there are some things which just don't correlate because they could in principle, but they're not doing it. So they're appearing with low or no correlation, even though they appear in the corpus. But in fact, these are relatively few, but there are more of them in the extreme. And then there are certain concepts which do not occur in some of these subcorpora. So for example, if we look in moderate, the word Jahannam, I suppose the rough equivalent in Christianity would be hell, isn't mentioned, whereas it is mentioned in the other categories. So sometimes the reason that we're not seeing certain correlating pairs occur in some categories is that elements of that correlation pair are just not mentioned at all, whereas they are mentioned in the other categories. So that's something to consider as well. Now, of course, once we start to see correlation, and I'm sure some of you have thought of this already, it's another tea break, I'm afraid, we start to think of collocation also. And I'm sure that some of you have thought of the question, well, wait there, couldn't these things just be collocates? Because if they're collocates of one another, it's almost certainly going to be the case that they're correlates of one another as well. So really, Tony, you should have started out talking about collocation. Well, actually, interestingly, this is where I look slightly smug, we're glad that we started with correlation because, in fact, they're generally not collocation. Now, there are some exceptions in each category, but in fact, it's pretty much one. So in the extreme category, 𝗂𝗲 and 𝗟𝗃 are both correlations and collocations. 𝗂𝗲 and 𝗟𝗃 are also correlations and collocations in moderate, but it's 𝗃 and 𝗵𝗃𝗃 in moderate also. What we do find in terms of collocation, however, is that many of the terms auto-collocate. So they collocate with themselves. So if, for example, I've used the word 𝗂𝗲, it might be that I use it again within 5 words. A standard collocation window is what we used here, and we use an effect size measure for those of you who are interested in how we calculated these collocations. In fact, it was log ratio, so it's a combination of effect size measure with statistical cutoff. But it auto-collocates. So these are words which seem to be occurring, and if they occur, they're likely to occur again quite quickly. And I was reminded powerfully of the work of Church and Gale in 1995, where they identified some words that exhibited a property that they called burstiness, which is once they were used, they were likely to be used again quite swiftly and used again. So autocollocation seems to be linked to burstiness. There are certain words which, when mentioned in this concept, and in this case, certain concepts from Islam when mentioned, are likely to occur again very quickly. Now, this is apparent, this burstiness, particularly apparent in 5 words in the moderate texts, jihad, 𝗂𝗲, 𝗟𝗃, 𝗪𝗏, 𝗃𝗏, 9 in the fringe texts, I won't read the words out, and 10 in the extreme texts. And in all 3 categories, both jihad and 𝗂𝗲 self-collocate. So self-collocation seems to be a thing. Now, I must confess that prior to this study, I'd largely set aside self-collocation because I was very interested in how words which collocate with other words to determine meanings or attitudes in discourse, etc. But in this case, I thought to myself it was particularly interesting to think about burstiness and think about why these concepts are called upon so frequently that they appear to self-collocate. Now, to give an example in focus, I'll look here at the word jihad, which we've just heard about. Now, it does self-collocate in all 3 categories, but it does so with weakening strength, and we're using this effect size measure so we can talk about strength. It does so with weakening strength as we move from extreme through to fringe through to moderate. So if you like, the autocollocation is strongest in extreme, then next in fringe, and it's weakest in moderate. Jihad collocates with itself 142 times in the extreme category. And other than avoiding the plus and minus 1 position, so they don't say jihad, jihad, it collocates relatively evenly in all of the remaining slots, 5 words either side of the word. And the pattern is not the result of a single text. These are actually quite well distributed. So there isn't one text called I talk about nothing but jihad, and then they talk about jihad repeatedly. This is a phenomenon which is spread out across the texts. Now, the waning strength of the collocation itself might lead us to expect collocation in fringe is less frequent, and indeed it is, occurring only 8 times, and in moderate only 6 times. But in each case, interestingly, the pattern of distribution is similar to that in the extreme category. So while the burstiness, if you like, reduces in terms of frequency, the nature of the bursts, at least in terms of distribution within the collocation window, seems to be the same. So the burstiness is not a function of the word, but of the discursive purpose to which it's put in the text, we'd like to argue, and in particular of those in the extreme category. So here's an example from 𝗪𝗏𝗪𝗏𝗃. I should say I will give some examples today. None of them are particularly horrible, so don't worry if you don't like that type of thing. But here's 𝗪𝗏𝗃 talking about jihad, and we can see jihad bursting. Jihad with your wealth. The financial jihad has preceded the physical jihad in every verse except one. This is to the point out to us the importance of jihad, of the wealth of jihad, because jihad depends on it. In other words, no money, no jihad, and jihad needs a lot of it. Now, in this case, we do have a couple of collocations of jihad. But note also that it autocorrelates. There are other examples, sorry, 3. There are other examples of jihad which don't collocate, but they are clearly correlating. It's bursting. So jihad is mentioned at the very start, then a few words later, then it mentioned. This is quite a nice example, I think, to demonstrate burstiness. So jihad occurs 518 times in 17 of the 51 moderate texts. So it self-collocates only 6 times, however. So this self-correlation, as opposed to collocation, might be more key. Similarly, with an extreme, you can see that that's more marked. In the extreme category, compared to the moderate category, jihad is more frequent. It appears in a greater proportion of texts, and it engages in self-collocation more frequently. So that's what the strength is showing us. So let's come back to the idea of self-correlation. At the moment, we've been working at the purely lexical level, looking at word forms, seeing how they collocate with one another, collocate with themselves, and also how these patterns of correlation emerge from this set, if you like, of words that to some extent form part of the ideological complex of Islam. But of course, as linguists, we're always interested in grouping things which are similar together and creating bigger categories, and that helps us to simplify data and actually characterize it more broadly with reference to these higher node concepts. And indeed, we can thematically group these into broad semantic fields. Now, to some extent, when doing that, I'd always ideally like to use an existing ontology to do so, such as, for example, behind the 𝗪𝗧 system, which Tony mentioned at the beginning of this talk. But it's actually often the case that these general ontologies aren't that useful for specific research purposes. And here, I'm really interested in Islamic religious terms. And if I tried to use 𝗪𝗧 as it stands to categorize these, well, it hasn't been trained on them, so it wouldn't be very good. And even if I did, I think 𝗪𝗧 only has one category for religion. So the level of abstraction would be too high. It would just put them all in one bucket and say, that's religion for you. And that's not what I wanted. However, these terms are very well defined, and there's a very long-standing body of scholarship identifying what they mean, and also talking broadly about the different fields or different conceptualizations that they relate to. So we were able to use that, along with some close reading, to develop an ontology to capture the broad fields of meaning. Quite straightforward to do. And that allowed us to broaden the study of autocollocation to correlation. So are there words within the same semantic field which are correlating with one another? Those pairs of words that we were looking at before which were correlating, are they correlating together but they're from different semantic fields? Or actually are they correlating together within the same semantic field, to some extent adding an argument to burstiness? In terms of the ontology itself, this gives you an idea of the category. I've given you over on the right examples of words that you can look for. Sometimes we had to generate subcategories. I've also given you definitions of the words there. To give you an idea of the few occasions on which we use subcategories within the spiritual category, the general marked nature here, the unmarked nature is positive, but there are 2 marked cases, negative and mixed. So Jannah, for example, equivalent, I suppose, would be heaven, is the sort of standard spiritual positive thing. But then you have Jahannam, equivalent being hell, which is negative, and then Dunya, which is mixed. And Dunya, I suppose, the equivalent in Christianity would be limbo or purgatory. And then also within a category like us, talking about the body of Muslims itself, you can actually get an unmarked positive form like the Ummah, the sort of brotherhood. You can also get a concept like munafiq, which is relating to Muslims who are not proper Muslims somehow, if you want to put it that way. So in that case, we mark that out as negative. Okay, so if we apply this category system to the set of words we have and try and get this level of abstraction into our analysis, what do we find? Well, first of all, the key point is we do find that the data simplifies itself. And there I've shown you how many distinct pairs we end up with once we actually come down from the sort of lexical approach to it. So we actually reduce the number of pairs that we're looking at. That, of course, is also an indication that we've probably got words in the same category. So words which we thought were distinct at this level of abstraction are exactly the same thing. So we get this autocorrelation within the same category of words which don't necessarily collocate. So looking at the self-correlating fields in each category of the text, we can go through here. Authority. So words which are appealing to some spiritual authority. So in Christianity, you might sort of quote chapters or verses or the Bible. In Islam, you might refer to passages from the Quran or Hadith, etc. So where a word relating to authority is used and then collocates with another word, correlates with another word relating to authority, we've got 4 pairs like that within extreme, 6 within fringe, 6 within moderate. So that's how to read those tables there. So we can see both in terms of moderate correlation of these concepts and strong correlation of these concepts, we get quite distinct patterns. In terms of authority, for example, the one category where it's strongest, most frequently used, is within the moderate texts. They really do call very often upon scriptural authority, for example, or authority from the life of Muhammad, in order to actually make points. But we also see it within extreme, fringe, etc. So that allows us to get some type of view on the data, not at the lexical level, but at the more conceptual level. So concepts, as well as words here, are displaying burstiness. So we saw the example from 𝗬𝗍𝗄 before, where we saw a particular word associated with a concept jihad being very bursty. But we can also, at the level of concept, see burstiness happening as well. So we might have something like Hadith and Quran going along together in a text. The concept that's bursting is authority. And we might find that once authorities start to be cited, using different word forms to realize that reference to authority, we can see it start to burst. Now, there's a very good linguistic explanation for this, in our opinion, and that's cohesion by reiteration. Going back to the work of Halliday and Hassan, we see that this is actually one of the key ways within which cohesion is realized within texts. Quote, a word that is in some way associated with another word in the preceding text because it is a direct repetition of it or is in some sense synonymous with it. So if we're seeing these bursting concepts, it's a good way of looking at it. A good way of looking at it is to think of it as cohesion by reiteration. It's part of the fabric, the makeup of the text, to call on these cohesive devices. And of course, these cohesive devices can be called upon with rhetorical purpose. So when referring to a group, for example, it's possible to set up textual cohesion by using the same word to refer to that group repeatedly, or to use a broadly equivalent word to talk about. One might lead to, I don't know, autocollocation. The other would lead to this autocorrelation, where the same concept is referring to itself over and over again within a text. Let me give you an example here, a very brief one from an unknown author. It's about kuffar and Muslims. So the kuffar and the Muslims align themselves with the kuffar against the Muslims, kill them even if they're praying in the mosque. Even if a Muslim gives water to the kuffar fighting against Muslims, they are kafir. Okay. You don't necessarily need to know what those terms are to see what's happening. We've got some burstiness around the lemma Muslim. We've got some burstiness around kuffar. So these two things are occurring together, but note also that they're co-occurring. They're actually working together within the text to generate a discussion about what happens when Muslims help non-Muslims. And in this case, it's used in order to generate a non-canonical opposition. They're actually breaking the category of Muslims apart to talk about Muslims who do the right thing in their opinion and Muslims who do the wrong thing. Note in this case that neither kuffar or Muslim collocates with itself even once, but the words exhibit burstiness quite clearly. So none of those examples there 𝗵𝗂𝗃𝗃 or Muslim within 5 words of one. So in terms of our sort of classical view of collocation, they're not collocates, but they are clearly correlating. They're clearly forming a cohesive chain, and this autocorrelation captures them. So that's good. The correlation is a signal that this might be happening. And it's also selective. It is a strategy. As we saw from the heat maps, repetition is not occurring for every word. And as we saw from some of the abstractions that we carried out earlier on in the tables, it's not occurring in every category. Of the 11 categories, only 3 produce this effect through medium correlation and only 5 through large correlation. Some categories are well populated, others do not seem to produce the interwoven chains that we want to see at all. So there is clearly some evidence of choice happening here. I don't think it's random behavior. It's particularly interesting that words belonging to the us category do not produce this effect, even though these words are frequent in the corpus. And indeed, in the us category, you could say that those are the addressees of the corpus, so they may actually be taken to be assumed. Also, of the categories which do produce these self-correlating fields, the fields are not the same in each text category. So that seems to break these 3 text categories apart. So, for example, self-correlation in moderate, authority and adherence, do not self-correlate at all in extreme and fringe categories, and adherence only self-correlates in the moderate text and not at all in the extreme or fringe data. So we can see that there are real differences in terms of how this collocation and correlation and cohesion are occurring across the 3 texts, and start to imagine ways in which this may be a motivated behavior. So why is that the case? Well, part of it, I think, certainly from looking at the examples that we looked at, is where we're getting definitions. The need to distinguish apart 2 concepts in this particular case leads to them being brought together, chaining in a codependent way. The 2 words are taqlid and deen. The need of the discourse to introduce, link, differentiate concepts is realized, or at least visible, through lexical cohesion, which in turn is observable to a degree through correlation. So our measure allows us to see something, and having seen it, we can identify what it is, cohesion, and having thought about the cohesion, we can then see the purposes to which cohesion are put in this text. Very often we find this definition. Think back to the example of jihad that we looked at before. 𝗷𝗚𝗌𝗄𝗃 was actually trying to define what he believed jihad to be, and that seemed to be the cause of the burstiness. He was referring back repeatedly to the concept he was talking about. Okay, another example here with jihadin can show you that again. We have this chain with jihad. We also have sunnah and hadith. So again, authorities being referred to, and these 2 things are going together. In this case, we could say that the overall purpose of the text is to describe jihad, give a definition of it, and then that we have this correlation with authority, which explains why you should believe their definition of jihad. So the burstiness around jihad linked to definition, and then the correlation with authority, if you like, lends weight, lends credence, lends authority to the definition. I think I've got this pretty well timed because I'm now through to the explanation of this. What drives these choices then? Why is it the case that we're seeing these concepts being appealed to the extent that they burst, they correlate, they collocate? We're seeing differential patterns in the data where some concepts are being drawn on within one category but not in another, and then heavily relied on in certain categories and ignored in others also. So extreme drawing on something, moderate drawing on others. Why is there this link through to also definition that we seem to see quite often? Well, our explanation for this relates to work by Pierre Bourdieu on symbolic capital. So if you like, symbolic capital, the idea that within what we do, what we write, etc., we can actually generate some capital, not money in this case, but the capital of the symbol, the capital of ideas, the capital of authority that we might want to use. A nice example, actually, of this comes, I think, from the Arabic loanwords that we looked at earlier in the talk, and also the comment that I made about how these more unusual, you might say conservative, but certainly non-standard spellings are produced for certain words in extreme text, which seem to try to preserve features of Arabic pronunciation. The reason for that, of course, is that for adherents of the religion, the words themselves have symbolic capital. They have a value. They're recognized as legitimate, and the perception and appreciation express the state of relations of symbolic power. These are words of power. Remember that if we see a word like jihad, or if we see a word like jizya, it gives us a link back to the Quran. And for people of the Muslim faith, or people who follow Islam, those aren't simply words written by a human being. They're words dictated by God himself. So the words do have very powerful symbolic. I also want to come back at this point to the point that I made earlier about the finding on register not being one which in some way problematizes the approach to register that we took. I think it makes perfect sense that all of the texts are written in the same register, because register also has symbolic capital. Hence, it is relatively static. If I want to draw on the symbolic capital of religious language, for example, I can do it in English by throwing in these, thous, and they, thou shalt, etc. All sorts of archaic English is associated with that particular register. It's the same, I would argue, with Islam and writing about Islam in English. There is a register. That register is associated with the symbolic capital that we get from the religion. So why would you change it? So the register actually results are very helpful because they demonstrate that symbolic power in action. They're drawing upon it. So such social power used to constitute what Bourdieu calls a consecrational revelation, and it represents political power. So if I use terms from the Quran, it's not me saying it, I'm using the words of God, and consequently also definition becomes very important. I'm interpreting what God says to you. Now, within symbols of systems of religion, it's already been said that symbolic power finds expression in everyday classifications, labels, meanings, and classifications that subtly implement a social as well as symbolic logic of inclusion and exclusion. So it makes perfect sense to draw on these concepts and then classify, label, give meanings to them in order to produce particular worldviews. And in producing those particular worldviews, we get explanations of the terminology explored in this analysis. We can get this sort of Manichaean worldview, if you like. What is good? What is bad? Defined through the definitions produced. We can generate insiders and outsiders, sometimes using non-canonical opposition to do so. Again, we can draw on symbolic power to give ourselves the power to say, this group is bad, this group is good. Different forms of struggle and conflict that can arise from the logic of this system. I can use the logic of the system to draw on the concepts, use the devices in order to define something like jihad, for example, in a certain way, so that if you accept the symbolic capital that I bring as being persuasive, I now tell you what this particular word means and can begin to also explain how you should behave as a consequence. So the authors are claiming social authority to impose symbolic meanings and classifications. They do this through public recognition of their capital holdings, so how important they are, if you like, in the context of the religion, and positions occupied in social hierarchies. In that context, again, drawing on the right register is an important act. Textual authorities can be derived directly or indirectly from the divine, and that is important in terms you get this definitional preoccupation in the corpus, cast afresh, redefined. So actually what we're finding is people are drawing upon a certain body of knowledge, the Quran in this case, and then redefining it through changing definition. And sociologists talk about the doxa, the natural order of social order. Actually, what's happening through the process of redefinition is the doxa is being challenged and changed. Note that there's the relevant link to orthography also. The orthography, to some extent, becomes symbolic capital because you're trying to drive the spelling back closer to the original. So religion as a form of social organization can draw upon this apparently infallible guide. So you're saying these simply aren't my arguments, they are the arguments of God. But interestingly, in these texts, doxa is actually the fulcrum of change across the categories. In the moderate texts, you get lots of references to authorities, for example. They are giving standard definitions of these texts. Sometimes actually when you look in the moderate text, there's no need for definition because they assume all Muslims would assume, would know what these terms mean. In the fringe and the extreme texts, you find a greater preoccupation with definition of basic concepts because they're trying to change the doxa. They're trying to change the worldview of the people reading those texts. As part of doing that, they're trying to establish their credibility, their credentials, as you like, as authorities. So they're drawing upon authority from texts, but they're also showing that they're better at spelling these important words than other people are, for example. And also they're using the correct register all the time. So we get these important nominations within the symbolic fabrication of collectives. In other words, defining these terms becomes an important way of forming groups. The people who accept your redefinition of the terms become the group who will act with you. So symbolic capital is used for naming and definition. Naming and definition in turn form symbolic power. If you believe what I'm saying about this definition of jihad, and you believe it because I say it in the right way, I reference the right authorities, I persuade you, then you accept my symbolic power and you're formed into a new group. There's a new doxa. You will actually follow my authority. So Bourdieu himself said the categories of perception, the systems of classification, that is essentially the words, the names which construct social reality as much as they express it, are the crucial stakes of the political struggle, which is a struggle to impose vision and division. And that's exactly what I think we see in the extreme texts. This reworking of the doxa, collocation, correlation, definition, cohesion, all working together to form a new worldview, a non-canonical opposition to what's being expressed over in the moderate text. So in conclusion, I'm only a tiny bit late. Register itself, although initially in my talk you might have been thinking, well, that's fairly useless, just showing something's the same. It's very important to show it's the same because register is a form of symbolic capital, and it demonstrates that register isn't actually something that the extreme texts are challenging. They're drawing on that symbolic capital, and the challenge instead lies at the level of definition, the doxa and the challenge to the doxa. And a lot of that is achieved through cohesion, through collocation. There's a link to topicality, of course, also, but it also signals a challenge to the doctrine. You thought you knew what jihad meant. It doesn't. It means this. And it drives that definitional preoccupation in those texts. So persuasion is not simply to violent acts. It's also, if you like, to conceptual violence. You are doing violence to the words. You're saying, this is not the right way to view jihad. Change your view on jihad. It means this. And also exclusionary acts. This is not what to be a Muslim means. Being a Muslim is like this. And if you're not a Muslim, you're munafiq, you're like that. So that's important also. Now, the work I've talked about today is one of 3 pieces of work which we've written around this data set. This work will appear in an edited collection, which I've listed there, which is forthcoming from Innsbruck. The work on cohesion, which I talked about today, is already out, and that's in Discourse and Society, and I've given you a URL reference to it there, and that's open access, so you can all go and read it. And then there's broader work on language and violent jihad, which is coming out in a book from CUP. It'll probably be out next year. That doesn't cover anything that was covered here today and takes a more lexical approach. And also there's a chapter in there, I promised I'd tell you this, which also deals with some issues of code switching as well, if you're interested in